Okay, so as I was saying, the tech at the tech terminals only amplified their weapons. There was something called the Aztec Nazi timeline that would have changed the entire course of the world if it had been allowed to run its course, which was stopped at Leipzig, Germany. So the Aztec culture was a complete death culture. The only completion of it was a death cycle. They didn't care about life, only the afterlife. They were driven as if by a motor to be fodder in a celestial fire that they longed for, and that's exactly what they got. They were like psychonauts more than cosmonauts because they couldn't get it right and thought math could save them or all these other sciences. So they acted more like technicians, hyper focused and fixed on all that they looked at. Hyper focused. They lost their humanity, their emotion, their soul. They sold themselves out. They sold their souls. Their original culture was lost. They were like a form of an android. They created a blueprint to conquer the earth from, the Inca trilogy, worshipping three planets just like in the Book of Mormon. Another false trinity. They called their days Olin. Okay, what did Mormons call their moon? Olia. They were imperialists. MIA backwards. They were reaching their end at 800 to 900 in the 8th century, and that's where they created their master plan for an infinity loop, 869. They messed with the timeline with their calendars, and tech gave them power by covenants and agreements with the fallen powers to have two calendars, two cycles made every 52nd year century. They were preparing for the end of the world always. They would jump at certain intervals as they had a galactic calendar clock and an earthly calendar clock that they went by. So they got enough power and momentum to open up a time gate to jump with. They were also very paranoid. So they extended farther than the Roman Empire and did more in their time. They had to prove this to the world. Under their influence of cosmic intelligences, they performed brain surgeries on each other at a mass level, implanting themselves and becoming shells in order to gain more power. This is what turned them into the cybernetic ascended machinery beings that they were. The black programs used this for research advancements. And they also used stone towers to tell time through, watch the sun through. They waited fervently for different suns, different ages. They were waiting for sun number 3. They believed a giant hummingbird entity would resurrect their dead warriors, and this Nephilim spirit did. When the Lamanites were cursed among them, they didn't get resurrected though. So the Lamanites in the Book of Mormon, they were walking around naked. They were prostrating themselves before the devil. That's what it shows at the Mayo Clinic on that hanging black person that's actually a Lamanite, a rotting naked Lamanite. It's not a Jew because Nazi research was done in Rochester at Mayo. Okay, the Lamanites died eventually. These were like dark zombie beings. This wasn't like, oh, you were cursed, like the Book of Mormon says, with dark skin. It wasn't like African American color. This was actually like you had been rotting in the grave type of darkness. They were like dark zombies that had already been in the grave for a long time because they ate flesh for so long. There was no reasoning with them since they were just shells. So you'd walk past a building and like I said, you'd look up and see a small Mayan man standing there, one of the intruders, casting his shadow down at you from the open arches and the windows as you were walking down the street. Iowa is full of these structures. The monstrous beer complexes were actually the stone brick smelting production lines. The large smokestacks were burning our dreams, gouging our gorgeous landscapes out, and erasing our natural terrain day by day. The Midwest was the most beautiful part of the country. The Midwest was gorgeous, and they made it flat. They didn't care about nature, only in building more of their monuments around what was already built to inhabit from the old world. This is another reason why Aztec Art Deco architecture is confusing. It was just a word made up by the Space Bureau, I'll call them, to try to validate the building as Art Deco. It confuses people because so many cultures were engulfed in this type of architecture. They had dominance over women that were sacrificed. There's statues of like a Roman holding a small woman in its hand in Nashville, Tennessee. But what was changed was that these statues originally were all holding ball hoops because that was the Aztec game played in the ancient coliseums and arenas in America. In the baseball fields, they were changed to wreaths to look Roman, but they were the Aztec ball hoop game. Plus, the future Nazi alliances that were buried in history too are all over our architectural structures, and that makes it even more confusing. So, the Civil War monuments were Mayan effigies too, with the tops that were just taken off. And they were called different structures in the first, second, or third empire. First for Inca transcending, second for Aztec transcending, and third for Mayan transcending. Their prime directive was time travel to get off Earth, since they were already under the illusion that they'd conquered all the empires of the Earth into their timeline display. They were lookout posts, just like the citadels. They were parapets. The Anamosa State Penitentiary in Iowa was a prison of Aztecs for humans, and it had an underground aspect to it where humans would be rounded up and taken underground to the temples. Iowa was called the City of Monks because they barely spoke to us. And yes, there were monks there too, but originally it was named because of that factor. They could communicate in tech waves and psychically, and only seemed to want to communicate if it was to draw you into their mission somehow. And they were very raw and deceptive in everything that they did, and they were very calculating and cold. The Iowa State Capitol says there's no records of anything because they kept records in a shoebox. So there was a lot of fake names assigned to this era and skill sets given to prestigious humans to explain just the advancements and what people were seeing, not receiving, but what they were seeing. And that was used to take credit for things of the old world and what the old world did, and to cover up for the Mayan infiltration. And like one man's fake name was like Mason Builder with Mr. Mix, the architect of all architects, and a lot of the pictures were all staged. And enough of the old world and timeline was saved and tucked away into the newer constructs and architecture for when people were ready to decompress. And that was the end game for this decompression time that we're in now. Many cities say founded on them instead of built for reasons. Buildings were opened instead of built for reasons. The Corn Palace has a shadow beginning, and it's no coincidence that Iowa, the Aztec capital, was peppered in corn. Not the American dream that we expected on these shores. Apocalypto, the movie, was a litmus test for Americans, and it was to test the American psyche to see where we were at, our reactions, considering these events happened to us right here. So the Aztecs thought that they were greater than all empires on Earth and displayed it in creating and building because, like I said, they thought they were the creators. Designs that amalgamated all the empires into theirs, making sure that their imagery was the looming one that was over it all. It was a hybridized, egomaniacal time manipulation of building a world based on sociopathic tendencies to prove themselves as kings. They tried to make humans their slaves for eternity and children. Humans were co-opted into serving the Aztecs gradually. But the Lord promised they wouldn't return. Their offspring will never be hijacked. Our offspring will never be hijacked for, like in the past generations were for cosmic armies. And the Mayans' offspring will never be hijacked like their past generations, the ones that are still claiming genealogies to these groups, because there's still some survivors and some redemption there. Because I don't think that it was every single Inca that was born, every single Aztec that was born, every single Mayan that was born. Just a majority of them is what got cybernized into the armies of Satan. So we go to Leipzig now, Germany. This was an Aztec sacrifice world cross point. This was a sacrifice pyramid. That was horrific. The bottom had faces of it for the underworld to watch the sacrifice as the person was thrown down on it. Watching, that's why a black X was put down there, and flowers, because females, virgin females, were thrown down from on high. And that's why you see one of the statues holding back the arms of a young female. Now the faces had to be changed, and yes, there are people who knew how to use the tech that was left over to sculpt very fastly and to kind of melt or mold the stone. So many faces were changed, yes, to represent the correct timeline, and changed to Templar guardians with Archangel Michael in the front with the words "God is with us" instead of their gods. So the Nazi Aztec pact was created there. And this would have been a rift, if not corrected, that would have changed the face of the earth. and we would have been in perpetual terror. We would have fallen into entropy. God changed that terror, though, into triumph there. They also had a jaguar or a panther that would come from the body of water that was in front of this temple and come and eat the body of the girl that had been thrown down. And there's reasons why there's 4 gods that were originally there. So they had an ephemeris of Eden. The underwater panther, Hydra, worked conjointly in the intelligences behind the constellations. It was also called Alanthopeda. The panther was a Babylonian beast, Nergal, who guarded the underworld, Mishi-Bizhu, Cygnus Cepheus, Pabalsag, and the eagle and a dead man were also represented in the constellations for them. The rising winter solstice. The only thing that they offered us was the dead man ritual, where man could become like them and then become ascended machinery to go get burned up in the sun. That was your reward. They did ritual killings on the solstice to bring back the sun's presence. Some of their language and influence trickled into natives, but the natives mainly stayed compartmentalized in the takeover. When the Black Hearts came, the blues of every kind, Great Depression, was more of a mind conditioning to rectify a level of normalcy to the society and not go too far back into getting stuck in the past, but keep moving forward, even if it was a slow progression. Humans were traumatized in this time period. Okay, entertainment was a key to break one out of falling back into soul trauma. The Mayans never disappeared. They migrated and even teleported. And like I said, Satan was searching the earth for an army of the fiercest warriors, and it was them. He found them and appeared to them in South America. The Aztecs had killed off a remaining tribe of giant beings whose skeletons were scattered through the forest and hung in the trees. So Satan told them they would be the most powerful empire on earth, showed them the other powerful empires, Rome, Atlantis, America, and it was ripe for the taking. They believed him and kept doing the fire rituals to invoke him and the red sun demon entity that they spoke to about that spoke to them about the future. So they were told if they sacrificed and drank enough blood, they would be able to conquer these empires and bend time itself, a triumphal bridge. So they planned and prepared for their 5th sun schematic and the 5th empire final beginning of the new world. Their continual resetting apocalypto manifest destiny. They would do anything to make it happen and wanted their work displayed all over the world, the dead man in the sun coming back again. And their history showed up in the Book of Mormon as the Lamanites, the black necrotic-skinned leader of them hanging off the wall in Rochester, Minnesota, Mayo Clinic. The Lamanite skin was darkened to a necrotic death skin because God said, "You want to worship death? I'll make you look like death." But this didn't stop the other tribes from killing, and the Lamanites kept killing. And all over the place in the Midwest. So Joseph Smith acquired these records. Joseph Smith was an SRA. He came from a lineage of that. The CIA had a very large stronghold on Mormons because they were also used to continue a false narrative and use the Native Americans as a scapegoat in this whole cover-up. The Mormons were used to distract further false narratives and cover up the past pre-revolution. The Book of Mormon's an event that ended up with many bloody wars in the Great Lakes basins that were also buried. Those were 5 war arenas for superiors and inferiors, the heads of tribes. Their sun god was the most violent god in all the pantheons, who they venerated for fighting star demons, lesser beings than it. And that also goes back to star fort activations used by Old World Pangea and known and built by many groups and even Vikings. So they also worshipped winged beings. They had reptilian influence overlords. The hummingbird to the left. They wanted to travel to overtake empires of the moon. They had a moon chain league. They believed that the hummingbird would resurrect their dead warriors and that they'd just keep coming back. And they did. They'd invoke all kinds of things. The god of paradise, Tlaloc, and Calchahutliku. The paintings of paradise left over in some of these places aren't the paradisical Garden of Eden, though, but another cosmic location. And a lot of these paintings got left in their tech terminals, the train stations. So you get Kolab, God's planet, in the Book of Mormon, and Olia, the moon. The Book of Mormon also has its own onomasticon. These are all Aztec hybridized words, and all these O words come from this culture, and long O names. Ometeotl and Opochitli. They also called something the Palace of the Moon when the female consort came into the St. Louis station. And she had a turquoise headpiece on that was like a rounded oval headpiece on the top, almost like a kokoshnik. And they had an otherworldly glow to them, which when they were got activated, it was like a Luciferian light that they would be gaining. And you'd hear it ramping up. It wasn't a celestial glory light that would bring an anointing or something to the people's faces like Moses had by any means. It was terrifying with the sounds of the tech going full speed with it too. So the glacial lie being millions or hundreds of thousands of years ago is also a lie. America was built on human sacrifice and blood, but it was birthed by God's divine intervention when the time wars ended. And he gave us this country. He gave us the spoils of war. He gave us a unfrozen infrastructure that was already here with the most beautiful things to inhabit because he loves us. The unfrozen infrastructure that was frozen in time was readily available to inhabit. Every large structure was built as a temple. Bathrooms were later installed later everywhere. There would be red triangles and green shapes adorning most Art Deco buildings with black overtones. Everything was temple-like. You could tell which culture influenced the build of certain ones and others where there were power struggles. Train terminals reflect old world ceremonies with a picture of two earths and an ancient image in between. And some of them, before the convergence, the overlapping timeline that settled, all these crazy artistic otherworldly motifs adorned the stage and kept popping up randomly as if buildings, things, and time were changing. In reality, there weren't much anymore, but people's minds were having a hard time processing two worlds crossing over each other in a peaceable manner that would make sense. And it's another reason why the Midwest is called the Heartland, because we needed to get our hearts back. Our hearts were literally ripped out to get our hearts right. There were just as many human hearts sacrificed here as there were in South America, if not more. The train stations that were tech terminals got charged up with the weapons. The eyes of the chiefs turned red. They were power hungry. You could see when this happened. They were bloodthirsty, just like the Nephilim and the reptilians had taught them to be for so many years. So God finally said, and he saw, enough is enough. They were wiped out by their own weapons in the end in the Great Lakes Basin war arenas. They were judged. God struck them down and buried all their iniquities out of sight. They were horrendous beings, malevolent and cruel and vindictive and worthless. The Soldiers and Sailors Monument is also, it shows things like a Viking-bred native princess, Valkyrie unit. This was a forgotten interbreeding in time as well. The continual cover-up capitalized on Native Americans aberrated history, though, for the most. And that's why in a lot of museums that we have, not the Native American museums, there are a lot of objects that should be removed because they're cursed objects. The shadow government grew with the shadow history of America the Beautiful. The history coming out earlier would have tarnished the reputation of a new, young, prospecting country if people knew the real savages that were here. There were many buildings and temples that always had gold and green gods on them holding golden orbs, suns. This is all South American mixtures of Atlantean designs and cohabitations. Crossovers, mixtures of architectures getting hybridized buildings with the essence of different races combined, so they create a friction and an intrigue when you look into them. The water towers in St. Louis, Kansas City were infected with smallpox, which was meant to infect the cat felines, and you could see that they had spots in their faces when this happened, like black spots, before interbreeding with the Masonic men, which I don't think happened. That was their intention to breed with them. So the Native Americans got caught in this mixture, and there were many casualties. You know, how easy would it be to put a bunch of Aztec stuff, change it up a little bit, into museums and say that everything in America was only Native American? The natives were told they didn't even have an original language, and the Mayans tried to get them to start speaking theirs, even though it was very few who spoke a lot, not many words. So the natives were experimented on in a lot of ways, but they had great victory with the whites in the end. There was a time when natives and whites fought against a common enemy, and that's been lost in oral history especially. I mean, like less than 10% now know their original language and oral history. And then the Jesuits came in and did other things and committed crimes against them, but there was more to the story than just white people came here and ruined everything. People were told about the savages. People thought that they were the savages. They were looking for the savages in any Native American. The World's Fairs had a pyramid house also for many reasons. Pyramids were a big theme going on there for a while. Um, so the Native Americans, they had an identity crisis imposed on them that wasn't theirs a few times. Once from the Mormon narrative, and then when the powers that be that founded civilization, after the aftermath, sought to eradicate any lingering reflection of the ancient barbarians that could have overtaken or be hiding in the native tribes, and then also with the Mayan factor that came in and tried to replace them, the savages. This is why Native Americans have a knee-jerk reaction when you try to tell them that they were a people that they weren't, that they were the people in the Book of Mormon tribes, because it's offensive. There's a deeper subconscious hurt there. So I hope more understanding comes to them through this. Why do you think they have such a hard time accepting that history as theirs and their God and the only true church and other things that were imposed? It doesn't make sense to them. The South American influence also followed me through later on in life as a panther spirit, and that panther spirit has been a phenomena in people that have cat race bloodlines even. And this panther spirit would actually scream outside my porch at night and bedroom for years. So there can be like spiritual warfare that had come out of this time period. So it began also because Joseph Smith was from an SRA family. He was teaching the natives an unknown language even for a while. The confusion in Mormonism, that's the trap, is the revelation that they get when they read the book. The Holy Spirit testifies. There's a truth in there, a historical chronology. But then they get stuck because then they go into the religion, just like you can do Dianetics in your living room and has nothing to do with Scientology. They get stuck there. They get stifled there. The religion overtakes them. And that's where the spell casting happens. And then when they go into the Mayan temples, then they get even more deeper into it. And then it shrinks their soul and their spirit in the end because they don't know how to get out of it. When the Ruachs revealed to them that there was some truth in what they read, and they're confused. So different races went underground in the vast underground complexes and then re-inhabited areas where the cannibals weren't. The Aztecs built under the breweries, under everything, so there was a vast temple-like feel underground a lot and strange fire everywhere. So that's why like modern day gorgeous underground beer chambers don't make much sense now because they're like temples. They wanted to take over more bodies and they thought they'd use children to do it. And the old ball stadiums like Yankee Stadium had many relics of them depicting odd objects and humans that don't seem like they're in this time. They were posing in different ways that also don't reflect baseball. And many statues have images of stoic figures holding the same type of circle that the Aztecs used for their ball games. It was dominance over the female genome, just labeled as wreaths in a lot of sculptures. A Greek warrior queen, like with a snake on her head, was a victory from the Aztecs in the arenas, coliseums over their females, and then they put a serpent crown on that. They challenged the greatest warriors through time in their games and their playing fields. In the World's Fair, there's a statue of like a Roman-looking bishop looking out at the water at the World's Fair at night. And this was Rome declaring its authority over the Popol Vuh, which was their Bible. Kind of like Elijah and the priest showdown all over again. And the crowds waited in eager anticipation to see who would triumph in the triumphal bridge. And then they get mind wiped at the entrance and the exit at each World's Fair with scanning tech. The Triumphal Bridge certainly didn't belong to connecting South America to North America, just like the posters had depicted two females, two matriarchs holding hands, connecting those two continents. There was something behind that. Nobody wanted that. The DNA seed lines hyperbridge hope of the Aztec rule. The lion symbolism also came from original Plejarian Hyperboreans. It was used with dominance over sports to symbolize Aztec wins. The buildings had designs that allowed for human sacrifice to be shown, And to happen openly with all the open circles from the very top. You could build a structure, throw a human down from the very top of it because they built like a pyramid. Greco Roman was a bleed through of the First to Third Empire trying to absorb dominance over each other. The hybrid griffin was loved as a symbol by them, and they just blended in with things. The world's fairs were like a showdown, used to power up tech that affected people's ability to think of the world only the way that they presented it when the towers were activated. And this is the way it was, always has been, and will be. And what you're supposed to walk out with thinking presently. So they never questioned their past. And people would get scanned in the end by a spider-like tech formation that was a hallway and an alley that you could only access the World's Fair going into and out of for a reason. When they related to one another, it was just for their own profit in different currencies or code words. So what I mean with that is the World's Fair said, oh, we made a profit to different countries. What that meant was it was successful. People are in this time, they believe this narrative that was shown to them. It made a profit. If it didn't make a profit, then they'd have to try something else. So it meant how many people were reprogrammed into what empire and what era in time that they were anchored into and what they perceived as right, or their reactions to memory bleed throughs as they went under the certain hallways, the spider-like alleyways that you had to go underneath the mind-reading device. So you couldn't leave really without being scanned, and it was like a old school form of AI that could communicate with you, trying to read your thoughts and alter your thought patterns, and there would be resistance if you didn't believe what you were shown at the World's Fair when you were trying to exit. You would literally fight with this thing getting out. So there's also the Adolphus building in Dallas, Texas, and that has the four Incan brothers on the side wrapped up in a cocoon. Those faces were later changed a little bit. So they were blatantly showing it to our face. This is the way it's always going to be, and asserting their dominance. The old Metropolis building in Minneapolis, that interior was designed just like a pyramid and for sacrifice. It represented a Dallas culture where they could continue their hidden sacrifice inside of a building and think that it could just be covered up. So the infant incubators displayed at the World's Fair were seated designer babies that would populate certain areas, and the orphan trains shipped the survivors of the old empire all over the land down to Oz. And there's also 5 of them. The tech was charged up at stations, and it wasn't primitive warfare. It could blast strong energy into the earth and each other, knocking everyone out. The bottom of the Great Lakes were like star forts cut out, and a bizarre, huge wipeout event happened there, and they were like basins of blood afterwards. It's weird that globes used to have ice on top of them, and then now they don't. That's been changed in time to where things that we saw before aren't seen decades later. The ancient tech that they had when they would do their warfare in the Great Lakes basins was, there's just thousands of different tribes coming to this area, and it's a very traumatizing, triggering, and almost probably the craziest event that the super soldiers have ever seen, because the ancient tech that they had in their hands when these tribes went to war could cause actual seismic and tectonic activity to occur, and it did on different occasions. And Pangea Empire was the first instance of this. The Atlantean Circle, cities, and the sea were substations apart from the mainland where sea creatures had some authority. Like I said before, they got humans to believe that they were less than what they actually were in the upside down world. But what happened in the Great Lakes basins is that the tribes ended up killing each other off, and what was left trickled back down as the remnant, the superior warriors that came back down to the Midwest, back to Iowa, and that was the remnant people had to stand up against to establish our nation. And the final fight, the final battle with the Blackhearts, which also happened at Niagara Falls. We had a sinful nature here of wasting life in America, ripping the heart out of life with those who had black hearts. The natives called the Aztecs, the tribe of the Black Hearts. Their eyes even turned black and red. Blood ran down the Hoover Dam from their own kind. America has habits and patterns she doesn't even know are from things long ago that can be corrected. Her wasteful nature is a sin from the past generations and wasted life therein. So, in America, we need to take care of our own people and make sure everyone's needs are met here first instead of scalping our vitality out for other nations and all these habits from our past that we don't know about. We need to grow up as a nation and be delivered from our past finally and given a chance to mature. Other countries are even more mature at these concepts than this young nation. So we need to take care of our weakest links so we can be the greatest nation in our example of greatness in God and Him alone and how He does it and how He wants us to do it and why He gave us this great land. And it's not by bullying the world like we were bullied before in our past and brutalized and sacrificed. Every nation has its own angel. Every nation has its sins. Every nation can be a sheep nation, though, and one for God. And all the compartmentalization and the states and borders and divisions that have kept us from being unified here and free can come down in gentleness. All those walls can. If we practice meekness, kindness, if we each do an inventory of what and why we're trying to run away from things and these problems and an enemy that we can't identify and things that and challenges that this land faces, the answer is not to turn our back on it, but to go through it. Instead, we can lift our nation up, reevaluate how we're helping it, and see God's hand moving and working through it. We just want to be like children that just want to give up all the time. And, oh, yeah, we deserve it. Let's just let God destroy America. Or that's something a 2-year-old would say, okay? God didn't call us for that. The fences of a Babylonian system are no match for what God can do here, anywhere in the world, and what He wants for His people. All the things He wants done here in His holy desires. Okay, the devil wants Americans in complete disarray, to get them stirred up easily, divided. When we know God is with us, there's peace there in every storm, and He's in our midst fighting our battles. And that's the end of the line. The current evils can be swept off the land again, and they will when we believe He can do it. There's so many learning curves and lessons God's brought America through. And yes, He can bring us to our knees again like He did in the past, but it doesn't mean He's going to destroy us. All these theories and all these lies we've been told, they're still lies. Okay? God is still patient and tolerant of her and of His children here. He's not going to come and destroy a place that has more of His children than probably anywhere on the earth. Okay, that doesn't make sense. Only His blood He shed and living water can cleanse all these stains from North to South America. And His word can speak a better word from all these echoes of the past and all these secret and silent wars and our hidden history. And the courts of heaven will be full when more people wake up to this and prophecies get fulfilled. Okay, He's asking us to take the shackles off. He's asking us all as Yehovah to receive new garments and trade our garments of heaviness for gladness and to stop acting like little children. We're forgiven. We're set free. The spirit that will move upon the Native Americans and God's children in America will be a wave of righteousness that pushes the past sins behind us, and a new horizon will be known by all who are called in His commissioning. The anointing they will have when the Native Americans rise up in Him as children of Yahweh again will be louder than any war cry they can ever sing together in the loudest of powwow arenas, and it will heal this land. So pray for them. Because of their response and obedience to the Most High, He will be their Lion of Judah who walks with them again and who roars in their midst. And this is a prophecy for America. They will rise up with wings of eagles, and they will run and not faint, and they will sing a new song to the Lord of hosts. So America is the land of the free. God freed us from this bondage like a jubilee. It is the home of the brave because you had to be brave to look at some beasts fully possessed with red eyes in ancient temples and have no fear. Mormons are deceived in the religious part and why it became the most organized, compartmentalized religion in the world. Okay? They took on a different face of the Mayans. It's a government-controlled religion on earth. The most. Okay? They've accepted and embraced an ancient evil that they don't understand. They don't understand the roots of it. They are under the illusion and the delusion that when the ice caps melt, the 12 tribes will come back. But they're going to be Nephilim, they're going to be giants. And they have been deceived into thinking that since the Mayan takeover in Missouri, somehow Adam will come up from the earth in Jackson County, Missouri again, with the ancient of old and all these other things. But it's not going to be Jesus who sits on their throne in the temple in Missouri. So these are the very elect that are deceived, and they need our prayers, not our condemnation, because you can't determine who goes to hell and who can't, because we have not reached that final judgment, and that great and terrible day of the Lord, and judgment is for the Lord, not for you. There will never be any real historical proof of building these megaliths, show proof that this building was built in certain steps it was. There's never going to be any historical proof of any of this because it doesn't exist. The Salt Lake Old World Temple, it was already there. They had a map of it. They went, searched for it, they found it, they coveted it, and they inhabited it. And all its old gods. They had it on a map from the cave records. That's why they couldn't show the records to anybody. They couldn't have people passive, but this is hard to describe why the MK Ultra happened in America, okay? Powers that be wanted Americans to get over their psychological paralyzation and traumatization from the Mayan timeline, okay? So they didn't want people passive, but they wanted them prospering enough to rebuild this country as a nation on the bones of the past iniquities. And the Mormons were duped into barcoding their souls into vaults in the mountains and off-world breeding because they think they're already gods here, just like the Mayans, and they want to rule the planets, just like the Mayans did. Okay, this is an influence from the America's cosmic invaders and the occultic essence that's all over their stuff that they inhabited, since they're under a false authority that's made them feel superior and divine. I mean, even in the children's books of Mormon, it depicts cheetah blankets over war chiefs and warlords and weapons and South American imagery. Like, why? It says that the tribes were just Native Americans. And then somehow they were cannibals, feeding flesh to all the families and sacrificing women on stones, which is exactly what they did in front of us at Camp Hero on lunch breaks at Montauk. It doesn't make sense. So the Mormon South American Quetzalcoatl Messiah also stems directly from their subtle brainwashing into the Aztec temples that they inhabit and love so much. Iowa had a lot of old world survivors, I would call it. Niagara Falls is a remnant of an old wall from a time of giant beings that were there. Okay, there's a Mayan revival building there. That was built by Mayans. They were here before America was even born. We've got future schematics and knowledge from these remnants and more engineering skills and advancements from old world generators that had just been abandoned and left. And we repurposed them, recalibrated them, and refurbished them into tech we have now. The institutions that were all over America, massive village asylums and complexes, were actually a clean slate for some people. They developed a will to live there, to create, and to love again. Some of these institutions were nice, more like a rich man's retirement home, and it seemed as if humans were being replaced from other crossovers for a while, from the flipping timelines, which I call the timeline flipping era. The overlappings that were completing themselves. After all those bumpy roads were traveled, you could put like pictures of the old world into an asylum and other things and give people a different reality to look at, a different window to reflect upon, things that they wanted instead of what they saw when they looked outside and got terrified. They wanted to look at things in what it felt like in the old world because they literally came from different timelines, which happened because of the World's Fair technology. Some of these people felt like if you threw them out of the asylums, you'd be throwing them out into the wolves, into a world that they didn't recognize. And some were places like PTS fear virus propagation reform centers and sanctuaries. Because if they got caught, if they went underground, they would be sacrificed. At least we tried to make them that. those types of institutions. Not all of these asylums lasted, though, and some were compromised, but many people got well in there. The spirit of fear is the spirit of terror, and that was all there was across the land at one time. Okay, our skies, you think chemtrails are bad? The skies back then in the Mayan timeline were absolutely horrid. It was a thick darkness, a gross darkness that hung over this land that the sword of the spirit had to cut through. We had to change our internal landscapes to create and recreate a new landscape out there and get people unstuck because it was like a jungle. And some people chose to stay in these institutions because they felt safe, and others felt integrated, while others died over time for complications or natural old age, or for sickness from the tech exposures, like radiation poisoning. And if an institution was ran by a benevolent old world survivor, they would just take in the refugees, and it was a decent place. But if an institution was run by other shady groups whose motives were not as gentle or gradual in growth charts, it didn't have the same results and was marked as a bad asylum for the mentally degenerate where experiments could happen, and it was hard protecting them all and weeding them all out. So why were people put in here? One reason was the beacon of hope that was created, and it was like a tower rocket that was over 1,000 feet. And this behemoth was crazy. I was convincing people not to go into this thing, but they wouldn't listen. Like sheep, everyone wants to go in and see the new thing. And there was auditoriums in there inside and 2 levels of seating, and it went into a hyperflux when the generators turned on. And it gave you the sensation of being in a rocket almost. So screens were also in the auditoriums showing different ages, generations, empires, etc., what was most appealing, and a history of everything from time immemorial. It was like a technically amped up learning living library where world history was displayed. And the inventors intended to fill gaps in generations lost. So there was a front row there of young Native American boys who went through the machine, and they never came back out. They got thrown into a different period in time. And some people, when they would amplify this tech, um, the goal was to, set up theatrics and somehow empower people, give them beacons of hope, and make people enlightened beacons of hope for future seeds, future generations, because people were being slaughtered. Generations were silently disappearing, so they wanted to fill this gap. But it backfired. Okay, what happened was a mishap and more problems in this puzzle of the world showcases and the beacon of hope machine. The timeline overlapping actually doubled. The timeline flipping opened up not so smooth transactions for fluent consistency and the beacon of hope pinpointing precision. The tachyon field axis mundi field generator used humans as batteries with devices attached to their heads, and that created a tachyon field in itself. But it was too many patterns happening all at once, so it did create more confusion and not the results intended. It opened up aperture loops to appear in a large cloud of a tachyon field burst. Lightning also struck the tower, and that was something that happened a lot, trying to redo and copy old diagrams and coveted diagrams from the past, manuscripts of ancient technology of the old world, but it always had hiccups. So the Nazis were also after this and anything left of the antediluvian societies, and the manuscripts especially. So the morphogenetic shape of this field that formed in the beacon of hope wasn't a quantum leap achievement, but it actually stunted like a piece of pottery, a clay on a potter's wheel, that went haywire. It was a stunted growth achievement. It was like a radio tower beacon antenna that had been broken and people got stranded. Populations burst at the seams like time refugees coming in and out of this thing, replacing the generations slaughtered. And they should have stopped it at the first round, but they didn't. They kept it going because you could be a mad scientist and it was legal back then. We called the tunnels slaughtering tunnels, so this was their brilliant idea of escaping them. The new people were in shock when they came to that timeline, which the Aztecs also loved, and it was a mess. They not only messed up the tower machine, these scientists, but generations. Generations literally disappeared, and new ones came in. So the censuses had to be burned in the future everywhere to cover up that whole mess. New archives had to be created. The Smithsonian cleaned up anything Mayan looking and made it Native American. Everything was only Native American. Most natives resisted the human sacrifices, though, and I do give them credit for that. Many statues seemed out of place after the World's Fairs, like the Caesar statue overlooking a glass pool there. That was a testament to Rome accepting the challenge, the empire of ages, and the reality that that became. So there was timeline blending, timeline flipping, timeline overlapping, timeline blending, hazing frameworks in the scope of our realities. And the Weather Bureau that was stationed inside of the Beacon of Hope was a Tesla Tech monitoring station office. This would record any atmospheric shifts in energy and anomalies of the colossal blunders. The scientists kept getting fired and replaced. They'd recalibrate the tech to suit subtler levels of atmospheric energy condensing until it wasn't so disastrous and more streamlined. I really think they gave people brain cancer in this. And the shape was supposed to create an energy beacon shape like a beautiful plasma gamma ray shooting into the sky, a beacon of hope, but it warped into a Vimana shape and people came out discombobulated after the effects of this, with many after effects. Some of them had to go into asylums to get set back right to before they went into the beacon. They had radiation poisoning, some people's hair fell out, their teeth fell out. The plan was to use the device to level up, to beat the current ruling power, to rise above, to use human design and plasmic field energy to open our hearts to the heartbeat of the earth and the universe itself. The human cavity, ley lines, other forces of nature. Too many things blended into one though, and you don't always many forces of nature don't always bend the way we want them to, or when we try to force forces of nature to do unnatural things and then put human consciousness into that melting pot altogether. Even the Montauk chair only had one person at a time. There was blowback, kickback, and a restart that had to be explained away in a way that didn't make sense to anyone, but yet everyone knew they had to accept it for sanity's sake and self-preservation. Then generations of natives that disappeared into the ground by so-called father races of the natives, the Mayans, they all lost their records. They lost their families. There's much more Hebrew relics found in America than there ever was from South America originally, and those were preserved and remembered somehow out of all that mess. And the Mayans, they became a degenerate non-human race, so nobody wanted to remember them. The ledgers of the natives that disappeared, the boys, the women, after the Aztecs blended into civilization, are gone. The Aztecs tried breeding them out, making them slaves, and tried replacing them. And brainwashing. Some natives fought right alongside the whites. The native genealogies were recorded in ledgers and kept track of until they were all burned in fires. There was no way to explain the disappearing bloodlines, and some whites burned the records to cover it up, and some Mayans did too, to erase their existence. This is the root of so much Indian pride too, and things that were lost. The mass graves, mounds, those are all a mixture of old king, queen, Nephilim, giant tribes, and also a lot of Mayans. They're not all Native American. What natives have known to be true and kept to the best of their knowledge, they keep in their museums, but I would say other museums are sketchy. Some of the erasing of names, faces, writings, and trying to wipe all the blood echoes off of the edifices was necessary to an extent. The Aztecs don't deserve any credit for what they were, what they did to us, and what they did to this land, and how they infected human progress by subjugation and a death murder cycle that would have no real utopia or lasting happiness for anyone in the end to live freely. That's the reality. We did declare independence from Britain, from France, from many nations actually, but our true captors that we were all slaves to once were the Mayans. Lifeless droid-like drones that built upon an empire that was already starting in America and took over that which God had already given us to inhabit. So their names should be blotted from the earth in this country, just like the Amalekites in the Bible, because there's righteous indignation there and a long bloody trail of corrupt and vile practices no one wanted on this land in the first place. The iniquities of those people are not our ancestors, but invaders, intruders, and murderers. And the same curses that were in South America came here, and we turned it in. We did turn it around, though. We turned it into God's blessings when we chose Him and His rule and dominion to wash it all clean. And they killed each other off. The consciousness setbacks and handicaps of the past can be resolved, and this pain brought out in the light of His understanding. And this should help others to know how to intercede better, how to pray, like I said, particularly for Mormons, some of which are the very deceived elect. And pray so that we can stop seeing division and stop believing the seeds of discord that have been sown among us. We have a tendency in America to continually divide and separate each other from one another. We all have more similarities than we do differences when you get down to the matters of the human heart and choosing what's just, what's right, and what's good. And that's what's going to get us back to the ability to have an abundant life. Okay, if ancient Americans can overthrow the wickedest race on the earth, why couldn't they overthrow a wicked ruler? That's an illusion. The evil ones will always do their evil, but we make the tides turn by our righteousness found in Christ. He suffered for all of this. He saw on the cross already all of this and the fate of our nation. The amalgamation of many nations that was forged here in a true melting pot. God doesn't want us to hate our land, our country. He wants us to heal it. It doesn't mean we should accept and tolerate evil when we see evil, but just broaden our horizons into how we can still love in the midst of tribulation, because we've learned this lesson so many times in the past. We've already been through tribulation. Love is the binding mechanism that keeps everything afloat and changes everything. And without love, there isn't any opulent empire or kingdom on earth that's worth anything in eternity or heaven. And Yahushua saw all the kingdoms of earth from beginning to end, and nothing was better than communion and presence and right standing in heaven with the Father. And he said no to every single one of them. The God of all things turned everything that was meant for our evil into our good, as his word says, and he did it on American soil. God has been faithful to America. We just can't see it in our blindness. He's in our midst, and he always has been. Love it or hate it, this nation will stand and take a stand against the Antichrist, because we've already seen the Antichrist of the past. And his people will be prepared for the final battles. Their hearts will not be troubled, because the heart of this nation was already ripped out. And God has given us a new heart, and he wants us to remember this. God gives us new hearts individually as his living temples, his living stones, whose splendor in the end of the ages and his progress will outshine the Mayan kingdom's shadow, because it's already overshadowed it. The same hand that stopped Abraham from sacrificing Isaac is the same hand that ended the sacrifices here, because he loves his children. He's given us the best here. That was the intention for America, to give us a portion of his best. What was best left over to start new with, to create with. He's given us ways to survive down here over and over again. We just have forgotten all that he's already done for us and how good he really is. All we're focused on is what bad and evil things people do or this and that, and we whine and complain and bitch about everything here. It's pathetic. Okay, he has seen all of it and everything America's went through already, and he bears with us. So we need to love one another and bear with one another. And there's no way to explain the heartache when you've seen someone actually sacrificed so brutally and it feels like your heart's ripped out. The heart is a mysterious thing, and the space in which our soul filters out emotions. But what he did on the cross covers it all, and a multitude of sins, and every sin that's been in America. Okay, people, you want to think that America is the great Satan? Well, who are you believing? Who are you listening to? That's pure Islam. You want to follow that or trust the word of God, which says, I will deliver you from the hand of your enemies. I'm going to trust God and not Islam. And all this emotional damage from our mind wiping on a mass level in America, all of that can be rectified. All of it can be cleared. But we just have to face it. Face it for what it is. And that's where the work starts. And as people start seeing more, waking up parts of their buried consciousness, there will be many reactions to explaining old world merging with the new world and things we see that we didn't see before. But we have to confront what's disturbing, what's real, and then want to understand the reasons before we just assume everything and then justify it in our minds and portray ourselves as some type of theologian and we know everything. And then on the other side of that, we could say, Okay, everything's just fake. We're not going to trust anybody. Okay, both of those are unhealthy. It's a lot to sift through, but we can wrap our heads around all the supernatural things and all the weird wars that have happened in America. You're never going to know all of them, but there is a little tying thread that will, help you understand an explanation for what's behind a lot of it. The Civil War veterans, like I said, confronted other worldly forces, non human things, clones and other missions in between with weird stories. Okay, let them be processed, let them be absorbed into the highest truth. Just because we don't understand everything and everything in our history doesn't mean that we can just be cruel to one another because we're on different perspectives and even consciousness levels. If we can't work together as a society without dividing each other by our words, deeds, and actions, we're no better than the failures of the past or the people of the past. No one should ever struggle like the people back then did, okay? We should be in a heart space to edify and bring the best out of each other. Instead of making fun of anyone you assume doesn't know as much as you, and be okay with admitting you're wrong. See our weaknesses. Presumption is a weakness, not a strength. We can always be better today than we were yesterday. Okay, and that comes with a renewal of the spirit of our minds. Some other things I'll go into is some people that were terminally ill from the tech terminal tram station rituals, they had effects from the tech wars. There was a massive cleanup of this everywhere. We call this fading out. We put, there's people put in a lot of homes, large compounds, and we called it the tech terminus time. It was like an old school Montauk Tower, the beacon of hope, and the recursive effects of it. So this was like an old school Mad Montauk chair design for a mass amount of people who thought it would be wonderful. And the scientists came up with the ideas if we tapped into the energy of the center of the earth, inner earth, we'd be able to create the tachyon field generator together, a tachyon mountain, and go see all the different cultures of the world, and somehow come back unscathed. Okay, they would go into the first platforms and auditoriums for being primed up to watch different cultures. The prime station. Then different empires would be portrayed to you, like a choose your own destiny type of thing. And uh, and that would be an affirmation of where you would want to go. And it was like a tower space rocket fueled by people's energy who needs a rocket when you got pure Axis Mundi power? This was the thought and the mad scientists. Fueling a tower occupied with tech bearings and frequency generators, and it sounded like a wonderful plan to certain scientists. But back then, people were a little off their rockers. They would come up with eureka moments and think it would be a renaissance movement. A eureka moment happened every day with people. They were desperate to get out of their situations. In their unbridled reason and logic that was thrown out the window, in the spur of any moment, they would actually act upon their ideas. And I cannot tell you how many insane cover-ups after insane cover-ups happened because there wasn't much limitations or restraint to what was the next best thing to pull people out of their present problems society faced, individually or as a whole, because more problems kept arising. We don't have the efficiency to solve problems back then like we do today. It was an endless society of problems that couldn't be solved. It was the wild Midwest, and that's what the old adage of there were no limitations or restraints comes from. The Blue Corn Palace eating first major mind-controlled group of that time was another sub-file of people eating a lot of the blue corn. But I'm not going to go into that one. The Space Bureau reclaimed many things after the last war with the Blackhearts through the Bureau of Reclamation, because we didn't want the Aztec abominable sites lingering and hanging around our country at the Hoover Dam. Many people ended up going along with the Mayans. That people were dealt with in a lot of different categories and groups, and after that there was a lot of hunting down people with the old world knowledge and other things, and they were threatened, and people just had a majority of silence, and they went into themselves and succumbed and figured it would be better just to never talk about it again. Like a big, massive MIB hunt down. The scientists tried to create armies stronger than the Aztecs, and they put inspiration in people through these theaters and beacons of hope and World's Fair showcases to have resolve and a fighting spirit within them, and to keep everybody in the timeline uniform and streamlined and consistent because it was chaotic. Compounds were a type of survival against the race that had blended in and destroyed our most beautiful part of the nation, so it was unrecognizable. They literally gouged out the entire Midwest, and they kept building around us to no end. So all we could do is try to fortify the compounds and the asylums with some of the leftover frequency weapons outside and inside that were left over. But it was safer to be topside than to go underground, because that was an underground sacrifice complex to the temples. They all led there. The sacrifices were down there in the tunnels. They were like checkpoints, guard points. It was a huge cavern underneath the land, so you never knew where you'd get taken to or end up if you got caught. And some people tried to escape through the beacon of hope, but ended up coming back in what seemed like a fizzled out giant time travel machine. But there really was no escape, just facing the Aztecs, the Black Hearts that were the dominant rule. Much blood was spilled in many areas, dams, right? The Bureau of Reclamations was for a reason. The government and secret space program and others wanted to cover up the mistakes, the misuse, the failures, the abuses of tech, and the brainwashing of natives that had a percentage integrated and had lost their entire identity into the sick Mayan patternings. It was a very troubling time period full of crushed dreams and hopes, but the beacons of hope we had rose up from the ashes, and we still managed to write fabricated wars into the books just to save our own skin, just to save our own face. Some wars were justified and somewhat factual, but there were a ton of them that were covered up and intergalactic in nature. And interdimensional damage was a result and an aftermath. And more people may be angered by knowing these things now than relieved, but that was also a calculated risk that was expected and will be dealt with now. And that comes with the brunt end of leadership in any type, so to speak. You have to come out the other side somehow. The Time Bureau tested human capacity and growth rates by how much they would accept time differentiations in building eras. So they put plaques on buildings saying this is what happened, this is who built this, blah, blah, blah. Okay, it went down from like 300 years, 200 years, down to this building was built, it's a behemoth, megalithic, crazy looking building in, say, 100 years. Okay, then they would gauge, and when people believed, oh, that building was built in 100 years, then they knew that they had solidified the initiative was solidified, and that people were getting better, which is like a catch-22. But it was a way for people to process the galactic events. Okay, since the Aztec calendars had that gap, which created a loop messing with time in their tables, it seemed like a good breathing space number, because the Mayans had 100 years, and let's get down to 100 years was the theology. So other world clocks that were affected by their havoc and messing with time were displayed all over the world, and other clocks everywhere to offset the Mayan calculations and emotive forces. And Prague was one of these places. Now the Aztecs thought that they'd mastered every science, the two greatest empires, and were going to complete their third empire loop into the sun and succeed. But they didn't factor in the resiliency of the human spirit. When people were faced with puzzling discrepancies in building markers and explanations of things, when they would accept more and more and more, then we knew society was prospering and overcoming the traumas of the past and achieving different potentials of the human design. Why not just let them think that they built all these things? Give them hope, give them something. This was an indication that the initiative was solidified and that the timeline fracturing had been bridged. They would put, like I said, built in a year over something, and everybody would believe it. Then we were all on the same page. But it was an old world-looking building in a metropolis. So when everyone started accepting certain things and were amazed, then humans thought that they were amazing beings again. that they could build these things and that they could do these things and that they've always done these things. It's just the way humans have always been. It was a very strange type of psychotherapy. They knew that the gap was closing with the timeline overlap and solidified initiative so that the new world could be anchored in. We needed future people here amongst all the dead to drive the future commerce and live in civility and hope. You can't have lifeless beings that are vegetables that have had their hearts ripped out try to make a sustainable community. It doesn't work. The old Americas are most definitively old Atlantis or Lemuria to the south. But the whole truth is that Pangea was really the oldest world influence, where it all started in the world like society. So the splitting and the split up parts of it widespread influence into a type of cultural compartmentalization. The Atlantis aspect, it never really sunk into the ocean. Just pieces like Bermuda, it's always been here, we're walking on it, and it's our land. The Novus Mundus, the New World, most seafarers mapped out as such, and they were all hesitant to settle here because of this face and why America is such a young nation with hidden history and all these crazy statues everywhere. Everyone was scared to come here, okay? It was also called the Indies, New Spain, Turtle Island. America had scattered relics from Pangea all over the place, like a centralization of them. Hebrew, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, all of it. It got integrated into a future landscape and an event horizon where the world really merged the past with the present for a better future. America became the most mind controlled country in the world, not because we're all inherently evil here and it's Babylon, but because of our secret hidden history. That's a blight and it's a blemish to our beginnings. The land of plenty was given to us to have this is the land of plenty that was given to us to have authority in, and we just lost our way.